Some scars never heal, but sometimes they lead us exactly where we need to go. Everyone deserves a second chance at love, even when they think their time has passed. Everett Kane is a wealthy cattle baron who has everything money can buy but nothing that matters to his heart. Clara May disappeared years ago when fire destroyed her family's home. Most people think she died, but Clara learned to survive with scars that go deeper than the mark on her face. When they meet again in the mountains near Willow Creek, Everett tells her something that changes everything. "You got a beautiful smile, Clara." Those simple words start a journey neither of them expected. Two broken people get a chance to heal together. But Clara is hiding a secret that could destroy their future. What is Clara hiding that she's never told anyone? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Kane ranch as Everett stood on his porch, fingers wrapped around a cup of coffee that had grown cold an hour ago. From where he stood, he could see nearly 10,000 acres of prime Montana grazing land, dotted with Black Angus cattle that represented more wealth than most men could dream of. The sight should have filled him with satisfaction, but instead it left him feeling as empty as the vast sky overhead. At 52, Everett Kane was everything the territory respected: successful, powerful, and rich enough to buy anything he wanted. His sprawling ranch house sat like a monument to his achievements, with hand-carved oak furnishings shipped from back east and windows that caught the light just so. The barn could house 100 horses, the bunkhouse sheltered 20 men, and his herds grazed on land that stretched to the horizon. Yet for all his success, Everett felt like a man standing in a room full of strangers. He pulled his father's pocket watch from his vest, the familiar weight of it heavy in his palm. The gold case bore the initials T.C. Thomas Kane, and inside, the steady tick had marked time for 40 years. His father had carried this watch while building the foundation of what would become the Kane Empire, working from dawn to dusk with calloused hands and unwavering determination. Thomas Kane had dreamed of leaving something lasting for his son, something that would stand as proof that a poor boy could make something of himself in this unforgiving country. But Thomas had also been a man who knew when to stop, who understood that wealth meant nothing without family to share it. He'd built his modest spread with love for Everett's mother, with plans for grandchildren who would run through these same fields. He'd never lived to see how his son would twist that dream into something cold and calculating. Everett snapped the watch closed and returned it to his pocket, the weight of it feeling heavier than ever. His father had been gone 15 years now, and his mother had followed just 2 years later. The ranch had grown tenfold since then, but the house had only grown quieter. "Morning, boss." Sam Wheeler's voice pulled Everett from his thoughts. The ranch foreman approached with the measured gait of a man who'd spent 30 years in the saddle, his weathered face creased with the kind of lines that came from squinting into too many sunrises. "Morning, Sam." Everett turned to face his oldest friend, noting the concern in Sam's grey eyes. "Cattle looking good in the south pasture." "They are." Sam removed his hat and ran a hand through hair that had gone silver years ago. "But you didn't call me up here to talk about cattle, did you?" Everett managed a slight smile. Sam Wheeler was one of the few men who could read him like an open book, probably because he'd been there for most of the pages. They'd started working together when Sam was just a young cowhand looking for steady work, and Everett was an ambitious rancher with more dreams than sense. Sam had stayed through every expansion, every business deal, every choice that had built the Kane Empire. And Sam had been there for the choices Everett wished he could take back. "You ever think about the old days, Sam? Before all this?" Everett gestured toward the sprawling ranch. "I think about them plenty." Sam's voice carried a note of caution. "Particular days you got in mind?" Everett didn't answer directly. Instead, he walked to the porch railing and looked out toward the town of Willow Creek, visible in the distance as a cluster of buildings beside the winding creek that gave it its name. The town had grown alongside his ranch, fed by the jobs and money his operation brought to the area. Most folks in Willow Creek owed their livelihoods to the cane ranch in one way or another, but success had come at a cost. In his drive to build something lasting, Everett had made compromises that still kept him awake at night. He'd partnered with men who operated in moral grey areas, made deals that benefited him while hurting others, and turned a blind eye to practices that would have made his father ashamed. Willow Creek itself told the story of his choices. The town had once been a thriving community of small ranchers and farmers, families who'd staked claims and built modest but honest lives. Now, most of that land belonged to Everett, acquired through business deals that were legal but not always fair. The small farmers had sold out or been forced out, their children scattered to cities back east or mining towns further west. "You remember the Harper place?" Everett asked suddenly. Sam's expression darkened. "I remember." The Harper homestead had sat on prime land along Willow Creek, where the soil ran rich and the water never failed. Robert Harper had built a good life there with his wife and 3 children, running a small cattle operation that provided for his family without threatening anyone else's prosperity. But the land sat right in the middle of what would become Everett's biggest pasture, and his business partners had convinced him that sometimes a man had to make hard choices to secure his future. Everett closed his eyes, remembering the night 15 years ago when flames had swept through the Harper homestead. The family had barely escaped with their lives, and by morning everything they'd built was ash and memory. The official story was that a kitchen fire had gotten out of control, but Everett knew the truth was darker than that. His business partners, men whose names still appeared on legal documents throughout the territory, had arranged for the fire. They'd called it necessary, a way to encourage Robert Harper to sell land he'd been unwilling to part with. No one was supposed to get hurt, they'd promised. It was just meant to destroy property, not lives. But Robert Harper's oldest son, Daniel, had been sleeping in the barn that night. He was 22 years old, recently returned from college back east, with plans to modernize his father's operation. Daniel had died trying to save the family's prize bull from the flames, overcome by smoke before he could escape. His body had been found the next morning, clutched around a metal box he'd tried to protect. Daniel Harper would be 37 now, Everett said quietly. Probably married, maybe with children of his own. Probably. Sam's voice was rough. The rest of the Harper family had left Willow Creek within a week of the funeral. Robert had sold the land to Everett for far less than it was worth, desperate to escape the memories and start fresh somewhere else. Everett had told himself he was helping them, providing the money they needed to rebuild their lives elsewhere. But he'd never been able to forget the look in Martha Harper's eyes at Daniel's funeral, not just grief, but a hollow understanding that justice wouldn't come for her son. She'd known somehow that the fire wasn't the accident everyone claimed it was. And she'd known that men with money and power rarely faced consequences for their actions. There was a daughter too, Everett continued, Clara May. She'd have been 17 then. 18, Sam corrected quietly. And she didn't leave with the family. Everett turned sharply to face his foreman. In all these years, they'd rarely spoken directly about what had happened that night. The subject was too dangerous, too loaded with implications that could destroy both their lives. What do you mean? Sam looked uncomfortable, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. Clara May Harper didn't leave town with her parents. She was supposed to, but something spooked her. Last anyone saw, she was heading up into the mountain country north of here. Folks figured she got lost, or maybe couldn't handle the grief. Search parties looked for her for weeks, and never found so much as a footprint. After a while, people started assuming she'd died up there. Easy for someone to get lost, permanent-like. Everett felt something cold settle in his stomach. In all these years, he'd assumed the entire Harper family had moved on, started fresh, somewhere far from Willow Creek. The thought that Clara May might have died because of his actions, died alone in the wilderness, driven there by grief over her brother's death, was almost too much to bear. "You think she's dead?" Everett asked. Sam was quiet for a long moment, studying his boss's face. "I think," he said carefully, "that some questions are better left alone. That family's had enough pain, but Everett couldn't leave it alone. For 15 years, he'd carried the weight of what he'd done, justified it as the cost of building something lasting. He'd told himself that the Harper family had moved on, that they'd used the money from the land sale to build better lives elsewhere. Learning that Clara May might have died because of his choices shattered that comfortable fiction. The morning sun climbed higher, burning off the last of the mountain mist and revealing the full scope of Everett's domain. Cattle moved slowly across pastures that had once supported 3 different families. The creek ran clear and cold, carrying mountain snowmelt through land that now served a single purpose, making Everett Kane richer. His father's pocket watch ticked steadily against his chest, marking time that couldn't be reclaimed. Thomas Kane had dreamed of building something lasting, but he'd never imagined it would cost so much. He'd never imagined his son would become the kind of man who could sleep at night knowing his success was built on other people's sorrow. "Sam," Everett said finally, "I want you to ride up into the mountain country, north of here, where the search parties looked for Clara May Harper. Boss, I'm not asking you to bring her back if she's even alive. I just need to know. One way or another, I need to know what happened to that girl." Sam studied his employer for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "And if I find something you don't want to hear?" Everett looked out over his empire one more time, weighing the comfortable lies against the painful truth. His father's watch ticked steadily in his pocket, counting down moments that could never be recovered. "Then I'll deal with it," he said, "whatever it costs." 3 days after sending Sam into the mountains, Everett found himself riding the high country alone. He'd told himself he was checking the northern boundary of his property, but the truth was simpler and more complicated. He couldn't stop thinking about Clara May Harper. The not knowing gnawed at him like a wound that wouldn't heal. The morning air carried the sharp scent of pine and the promise of snow, though it was only early September. Up here in the high country, winter came early and stayed late, making survival a constant challenge even for experienced mountain men. For a grieving 18-year-old girl, these peaks would have been deadly. Everett guided his horse along a narrow trail that wound between towering pines, their branches so thick overhead that the forest floor remained dim even in full daylight. This was wild country, the kind of place where a person could disappear without a trace. It was also beautiful in a way that made his chest tight, the kind of raw, untamed beauty that money couldn't buy or improve. He'd been riding for 2 hours when he heard the sound of someone chopping wood echoing through the trees. Everett reined in his horse and listened, trying to locate the source. The rhythmic thunk of an axe biting wood came from somewhere ahead and to the left, deeper in the forest than any reasonable person should be living. Curiosity and something else, hope maybe, or dread, drove him toward the sound. He dismounted and led his horse through thick underbrush, following a faint trail that showed signs of regular use. Someone had been walking this path for years, wearing it into the forest floor, one footstep at a time. The trail opened into a small clearing, where a modest cabin sat nestled among the pines. Smoke rose from the stone chimney, and a neat woodpile stood beside the door. A small garden showed the late-season remains of vegetables that had been carefully tended. Everything about the place spoke of someone who'd learned to live off the land with skill and patience. A woman stood beside the woodpile, axe raised above her head. She was small but moved, with the efficient grace of someone accustomed to physical labor. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical braid, and she wore men's clothing that had been altered to fit her frame. As the axe came down, splitting a log cleanly in two, Everett caught sight of her face. The left side was unmarked, showing the remnants of what had once been striking beauty. But the right side bore a scar that ran from her temple to her jaw, a twisted mark that spoke of fire and pain and survival against impossible odds. Everett's breath caught in his throat. He knew that face, even marked as it was. He'd seen it 15 years ago at Daniel Harper's funeral, when Clara May had stood beside her parents' graves with tears streaming down unmarked cheeks. She'd been 18 then, with her whole life ahead of her. Now she was 33, and the mountains had carved her into something harder and more resilient than the girl he remembered. Clara May Harper was alive. The knowledge hit him like a physical blow. For 15 years he'd carried the guilt of believing she died because of his choices. Now, seeing her here, in this hidden clearing, that guilt transformed into something more immediate and terrifying, the knowledge that she'd survived, but at a cost that showed in every line of her body. She must have sensed his presence because she turned suddenly, the axe still gripped in her hands. When she saw him, her entire body went rigid. The axe fell from nerveless fingers, clattering against the split logs at her feet. "No," she whispered, the word barely audible across the clearing. "No, you can't be here." Everett stepped forward slowly, hands raised to show he meant no harm. "Clara May, don't." Her voice was stronger now, edged with 15 years of hard-won survival instincts. "Don't say my name. Don't come any closer." But Everett couldn't stop himself. Seeing her alive, seeing what the mountains had done to the girl he'd helped destroy, broke something open inside his chest. "I thought you were dead. All these years I thought, I am dead." Clara's hand moved to the scar on her face, touching it like a talisman. "Clara May Harper died in that fire. I'm just what's left." The pain in her voice was almost unbearable. Everett took another step forward, driven by a need to somehow make this right, to find words that could bridge 15 years of silence and suffering. "Your family, your parents, they looked for you. The whole town looked." "I know." Clara's eyes never left his face, and Everett saw wariness there that cut deeper than any accusation. "I watched from the ridgeline. I saw the search parties." "Then why?" "Because I knew." The words came out flat and final. "I knew what really happened that night, and I knew that some truths are too dangerous to tell." Everett felt the world shift beneath his feet. Clara May studied him for a long moment, and Everett had the uncomfortable feeling that she was seeing straight through him to the guilt he carried. When she spoke, her voice held the quiet authority of someone who'd learned terrible lessons. "I mean that my brother didn't die trying to save cattle, Mr. Kane. He died trying to save evidence." The words hit Everett like bullets. He staggered, one hand reaching out to steady himself against a tree. "You know what?" Clara's scarred face was impassive, but her eyes burned with 15 years of suppressed anger. Daniel was the sheriff. He'd been investigating the land grabs, the forced sales, the fires that happened whenever someone refused to sell. He had names, dates, documents. He was going to expose the whole operation. Everett's mouth went dry. His business partners had told him the fire was just meant to pressure Robert Harper into selling. They'd never mentioned that Daniel was investigating them, never suggested that the young sheriff might have evidence that could destroy them all. "The fire was set to destroy what Daniel had collected," Clara continued, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "But he tried to save it, tried to get the evidence out of the house before the flames took everything. That's how he died, not saving cattle, but trying to save the truth. Clara, I swear to you, I didn't know, or didn't want to know." Her question was quietly devastating. "Because my brother's evidence had your name on it, Mr. Kane. Your signature on documents, your business dealings, your partner's plans. You were part of it all." Everett wanted to deny it, wanted to claim innocence, but the words died in his throat. Because she was right, he'd known his partners operated in grey areas, known they used pressure and intimidation to secure land deals. He told himself he didn't need to know the details, that success required a certain willingness to look the other way. But he'd never imagined they would kill to protect their secrets. "I was in the barn when they came," Clara said, her voice growing distant. "Hidden in the loft, watching them douse everything with kerosene. I saw them trap Daniel inside when he tried to save that metal box. I heard him screaming." Everett closed his eyes, but Clara's words painted pictures he couldn't escape. "I tried to help him," she continued. "Tried to break through a window, get him out somehow. That's how I got this." She touched the scar again. Broken glass and flames. By the time I could see again, Daniel was gone, and the killers were riding away. "Why didn't you tell someone?" "The territorial marshal, Tell them what?" Clara's laugh was bitter. "That the sheriff had been killed by men whose names were on legal documents throughout the territory? That some of the most powerful men in Montana had committed murder to protect their land deals? Who would have believed me? And more importantly, who would have protected me from the same fate as my brother?" The truth of her words settled over Everett like a weight. A young woman with no family, no protection, no allies, she would have been vulnerable to the same men who'd killed her brother. Going into hiding hadn't been cowardice, it had been survival. "So you came here," Everett said. "I came here to die," Clara corrected. "I figured the mountains would be quicker than whatever those men had planned for me. But dying turned out to be harder than I expected." She gestured toward the cabin, the garden, the neat woodpile that spoke of years of careful preparation. 15 years, Everett said quietly. 15 years of learning that being dead to the world isn't the same as being actually dead. 15 years of wondering if I made the right choice, staying hidden while those men got richer and more powerful. Everett looked at her, really looked at her, and saw not just the scarred survivor, but traces of the girl she'd been. The determined set of her jaw was the same, the direct way she met his gaze, the stubborn tilt of her chin that had made her brother proud. But there was something else now, something that hadn't been there when she was 18. A quiet strength that came from surviving when survival seemed impossible, a hard-won wisdom that had been paid for with years of solitude and grief. "You got a beautiful smile, Clara," Everett said suddenly, the words coming from somewhere deeper than thought. Clara May's hand flew to her scarred cheek, her eyes wide, with something that might have been shock or fear or hope. For a moment, the careful mask she'd built over 15 years of hiding slipped, and Everett caught a glimpse of the woman she might have been if fire and loss hadn't carved her into someone else entirely. Then she turned and ran, disappearing into the forest like smoke, leaving Everett alone in the clearing with the echo of his words and the knowledge that everything he'd believed about himself was wrong. Everett rode back to the ranch in a daze, Clara May's words echoing in his mind like thunder that wouldn't fade. By the time he reached the main house, his hands were shaking so badly he could barely dismount. Sam Wheeler was waiting on the porch, concern etched deep in the lines of his weathered face. "Found her, didn't you?" Sam said quietly. Everett nodded, unable to trust his voice. He sank into one of the porch chairs, suddenly feeling every one of his 52 years. The weight of Clara's revelations pressed down on him like a physical thing. The knowledge that Daniel Harper had been murdered, that Clara had witnessed it, that she'd spent 15 years hiding from killers who thought their secret was buried. "She's alive, Sam. Clara May Harper is alive, and she's been living up there in the mountains all this time." Sam's face went pale. "Jesus, Mary, and Joseph, all these years. She saw it happen." Everett's voice came out as a whisper. "She saw them kill Daniel. It wasn't an accident, it was murder, and she witnessed the whole thing." For a long moment, neither man spoke. The implications hung between them like a loaded gun, dangerous and ready to explode. If Clara May had evidence, if she could prove what really happened that night, it would destroy not just Everett's business partners, but potentially Everett himself. "Boss," Sam said carefully, "what exactly did she tell you?" Everett recounted the conversation, watching Sam's expression grow darker with each detail. When he finished, his foreman was quiet for a long time, staring out at the mountains where Clara May had made her hidden home. "We need to find out exactly what Daniel Harper knew," Sam said finally, "and we need to understand just how deep this goes." That afternoon, Everett found himself in his study, surrounded by 15 years' worth of business documents. The room was lined with oak filing cabinets that contained contracts, deeds, partnership agreements, and correspondence, the paper trail of his empire's growth. He'd always been meticulous about record-keeping, a habit inherited from his father. Now that attention to detail might be his salvation or his damnation, he pulled out the file marked Harper Property with hands that still trembled slightly. The folder was thicker than he remembered, filled with documents that told the story of how he'd acquired some of his most valuable land. As he spread the papers across his massive oak desk, a picture emerged that made his stomach turn. The land deed transfers were all there, signed and notarized. But underneath the legal paperwork, Everett found correspondence that painted a different story. Letters from his business partners Theodore Blackwood and Marcus Vail discussing pressure tactics and encouraging motivation for reluctant sellers. References to solving the Harper problem and ensuring compliance through alternative methods. Everett's own signature appeared on several documents, including one that authorized Blackwood and Vail to take whatever steps necessary to secure the Harper property. At the time, he'd assumed they meant legal pressure, perhaps foreclosure proceedings or liens. Now he realized his naivety had provided cover for murder. His hands found his father's pocket watch, the familiar weight of it steadying him slightly. Thomas Kane had built his modest ranch through honest work and fair dealing. He'd never compromised his principles for profit, never signed documents without understanding their full implications. The watch seemed to pulse with accusation against Everett's palm, a reminder of the man he was supposed to have become. A knock at the study door interrupted his dark thoughts. Sam entered without waiting for permission, carrying a wooden box that looked familiar. "Found this in the old tack room," Sam said, setting the box on the desk. "Been meaning to give it back to you for years, but never seemed like the right time." Everett stared at the box, recognition dawning slowly. It was made of polished cherry wood with brass corners, a strong box that had belonged to Daniel Harper. He'd seen it in the sheriff's office years ago, back when Daniel was investigating cattle rustling and land disputes. "How did you—" "Pulled it out of the fire myself," Sam said quietly. "That night at the Harper place. Daniel was trying to save it when the smoke got him. Figured whatever was in there died with him, but I couldn't just leave it to burn." Everett's hands hovered over the box, afraid to open it. Inside would be the evidence that Daniel Harper had died, trying to protect documents that could implicate not just his business partners, but potentially Everett himself. "You look inside?" Everett asked. "Never opened it. Figured that was Daniel's business, not mine." But now Sam's voice trailed off meaningfully. Everett lifted the lid with hands that had steadied through sheer force of will. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth to protect them from moisture, were dozens of documents. Reports, photographs, correspondence, and what looked like financial records. Daniel Harper hadn't just been investigating, he'd been building a comprehensive case. The first document was a map of the territory, marked with colored pins. Red pins showed properties that had been acquired through pressure sales situations, where owners had sold quickly after mysterious accidents or threats. Yellow pins marked properties where the owners had simply disappeared, leaving behind land that was eventually claimed for unpaid taxes. Green pins showed Everett's current holdings. Nearly every red and yellow pin now sat inside the boundaries marked in green. "Mother of God," Sam whispered, looking over Everett's shoulder. He had it all figured out. The photographs were worse. Pictures of burned barns, destroyed crops, and cattle found dead in pastures. Each image was carefully labeled with dates, locations, and the names of the property owners who'd sold shortly after the incidents. The pattern was clear and damning, a systematic campaign of intimidation that had transferred thousands of acres into the hands of Everett's partnership. But it was the correspondence that truly destroyed Everett's last hopes of innocence. Letters from Theodore Blackwood detailing specific plans for pressuring landowners. Notes from Marcus Vale describing accidents that could befall stubborn farmers. And scattered throughout, copies of Everett's own responses, brief, business-like notes that authorized his partners to handle the situation and resolve the matter quickly. He'd told himself he didn't want to know the details, that success sometimes required unpleasant necessities. Now he saw how his willful blindness had enabled murder and terror across the territory. The final item in the box was a letter addressed to the territorial marshal, written in Daniel Harper's careful handwriting. It was a complete report, naming names and providing evidence of the conspiracy. Daniel had been planning to send it the day after he died, had been preparing to expose the entire operation and bring justice to the victims. "This is what got him killed," Everett said, holding up the letter. "He was going to destroy all of us." "All of us?" Sam's voice held a note of warning. "Or just the men who deserved destroying?" Everett met his foreman's gaze and saw something that chilled him: disappointment, mixed with a loyalty that was being stretched to its breaking point. Sam Wheeler had worked for the Kane Ranch for 30 years, had helped build everything Everett owned. Now he was learning that his life's work had been built on other people's graves. "I never meant for anyone to die, Sam. You have to believe that." "What I believe doesn't matter," Sam said quietly. "What matters is what you do now." Clara May Harper has been hiding in those mountains for 15 years, afraid for her life. Daniel Harper died trying to bring justice. The question is, what kind of man are you going to choose to be? Everett looked down at the evidence spread across his desk, proof of crimes that had made him rich and destroyed innocent families. His father's watch ticked steadily in the silence, counting moments that couldn't be reclaimed, choices that couldn't be undone. But perhaps they could still be made right. The ruins of the Harper homestead sat on a rise overlooking Willow Creek, barely visible through 15 years of encroaching wilderness. Everett approached on horseback as dawn broke over the mountains, carrying supplies he hoped would begin to bridge the chasm his choices had created. The foundation stones were still there, blackened by fire but too solid to be moved by time or weather. Wild roses had grown up through what had been the kitchen, their thorny branches reaching toward windows that would never again frame a family's morning conversations. A single chimney stood sentinel over the remains, its bricks cracked, but still reaching skyward like a monument to what had been lost. Everett dismounted and walked among the ruins, trying to imagine what this place had looked like when the Harper family called it home. There would have been a garden where Martha Harper grew vegetables for her family's table, a porch where Robert Harper sat in the evenings planning improvements to his modest cattle operation, a room where Clara May had dreamed about her future, never imagining that fire and violence would steal it away. He found a flat stone near where the front door would have stood and carefully arranged the supplies he'd brought: dried goods, coffee, a heavy wool blanket, and matches wrapped in oilcloth. Beside them, he placed a letter written on his personal stationery, the words carefully chosen through a sleepless night. "Miss Harper," the letter began, "I know you have every reason to hate me and no reason to trust anything I say. I know my words cannot bring back your brother or restore what your family lost. But I want you to know that I never intended for anyone to be hurt, and I will spend whatever time I have left trying to make this right. These supplies are offered with no expectation except that they might make your life a little easier. If you want me to leave you in peace, I will respect that choice. If you're willing to talk, I'll be here every morning at sunrise until you're ready." He signed it simply E. Kane and weighed it down with a riverstone to keep the mountain wind from carrying it away. The ride back to the ranch took him through Willow Creek's main street, where the early morning bustle was already beginning. Storekeepers swept their porches, preparing for another day of commerce that depended largely on the wages paid by the Kane Ranch. The hotel served breakfast to traveling cattle buyers who came to negotiate deals that would further enrich Everett's operation. Even the small church at the end of Main Street had been built with lumber donated by Everett's lumber mill. It was a prosperity built on displaced families and buried secrets, and now that Everett understood the true cost, the sight of it made him sick. He stopped at Martha Henley's boarding house, a two-story building with a wide front porch where the town's older residents often gathered to share news and gossip. Martha had been running the place for 20 years, providing clean rooms and good meals to travelers and new arrivals. She was also one of the few people in Willow Creek who remembered the Harper family clearly. "Morning, Mr. Kane," Martha called from where she was hanging laundry on the side porch. She was a sturdy woman in her 60s, with grey hair pulled into a practical bun and hands that spoke of a lifetime of honest work. "Morning, Mrs. Henley. Wondered if I might have a word with you." Martha's expression grew wary. In 15 years, Everett had rarely spoken to her beyond basic politeness, and then only when business required it. His sudden interest was bound to raise questions. "Something I can help you with?" "I've been thinking about the old days," Everett said carefully. "The families that used to live around here before the town grew up, the Harpers particularly." Martha's hands stilled on the clothesline. "The Harpers. Now there's a name I haven't heard in years. Terrible thing. What happened to them?" "You knew them well?" "Clara's mother and I were close friends. Martha Harper was a good woman, kind, generous, always ready to help a neighbor in need. She used to send Clara into town to bring me fresh eggs and vegetables from their garden." Everett felt something twist in his chest at the image of young Clara May walking into town with gifts from her mother's garden before fire and loss had driven her into the wilderness. "Clara May," he said. "What was she like?" Martha studied his face for a long moment, clearly wondering why he was asking. "She was a lovely girl, quiet but thoughtful. Had a beautiful smile that could light up a room when she let it show. Her father always said she had the strongest spirit of all his children, but she was gentle too, good with animals, patient with folks who needed help. Her mother used to worry about her sometimes," Martha continued, turning back to her laundry. "Said Clara felt things too deeply, took other people's troubles too much to heart. Martha Harper feared her daughter might not be strong enough for the hard knocks life tends to hand out." "Turns out she was stronger than anyone imagined," Everett said quietly. Martha gave him a sharp look. "What makes you say that?" Everett realized his mistake too late. Just surviving the loss of her brother and having to leave everything behind. "That takes strength." "I suppose it does." Martha's voice held a note of suspicion, but she didn't press further. Clara May had her father's determination under all that gentleness. Robert Harper never backed down from what he thought was right, even when it cost him. After leaving Martha Henley's boarding house, Everett rode the boundaries of his property with new eyes, seeing not the success he'd built, but the families that had been displaced to create it. Every fence line told a story of acquisition. Every pasture had once supported someone else's dreams. The carved wooden cross hidden in Clara May's cabin haunted his thoughts, a symbol of the faith that had sustained her through 15 years of isolation. Her father had made it for her. Martha Henley had told him years ago, carved from oak wood with his own hands as a confirmation gift. That Clara May had carried it into the wilderness and kept it all these years spoke to a strength that shamed Everett's own complaints about loneliness and regret. That evening, Sam Wheeler found him in his study, staring at Daniel Harper's evidence box. "Any word from the homestead ruins?" Sam asked. "Too soon to tell. Left supplies and a letter this morning. And if she doesn't respond?" Everett looked up from the documents that detailed his empire's bloody foundation. "Then I'll keep leaving supplies until she does, or until she tells me to stop. Boss, you know this won't end with just Clara May. If she's got evidence, if she decides to come forward, then I'll face whatever consequences come." Everett's voice was steady, but his hands trembled slightly as he touched his father's pocket watch. "My father built something honest, Sam. I turned it into something ugly. Maybe it's time to tear down what shouldn't have been built in the first place." Sam studied his employer's face for a long moment. "And Blackwood and Vale? They won't just stand by and watch their empire crumble." "No," Everett agreed grimly. "They won't, which means Clara May is still in danger, and she's been carrying that burden alone for 15 years. The weight of that knowledge settled over both men like a shroud. Somewhere in the mountains, Clara May Harper was living with the constant fear that her brother's killers might discover she was still alive. She'd survived 15 winters in the wilderness, learned to live off the land, and carried the truth about Daniel's murder alone all this time. "We need to protect her," Everett said finally. "Even if it means destroying everything you've built?" Everett thought of Clara May's scarred face, of the strength it had taken to survive when the world believed her dead, of the beautiful smile he'd glimpsed beneath years of pain and caution. "Especially then," he said. For 5 mornings, Everett rode to the Harper homestead ruins and found his supplies untouched. The letters he left remained exactly where he'd placed them, weighted down by river stones, but unread. Each day, he added something new: coffee, sugar, a pair of warm gloves as the September mornings grew colder, even some books from his father's collection that he thought might help pass the long mountain evenings. On the 6th morning, everything was gone. Everett dismounted and searched the ruins carefully, looking for any sign that Clara May had been there. The supplies had vanished without a trace, but in their place, arranged carefully on the flat stone where he'd been leaving his offerings, were 3 items that made his breath catch. The first was a small, carved bird, whittled from pine wood with delicate skill. The second was a handful of wild berries, wrapped in clean cloth mountain huckleberries that wouldn't be found anywhere near the homestead ruins. The third was a piece of paper torn from one of his own letters, with a single word written in careful handwriting: "Why?" Everett picked up the carved bird, marveling at the craftsmanship. It was a mountain jay, captured in perfect detail, from the curve of its beak to the individual feathers on its wings. Clara May had made this with her own hands, probably during the long winter evenings in her hidden cabin. The skill required spoke of years of practice, of someone who'd learned to create beauty even in the midst of survival. The berries were a message too. They grew only in the high country, in places that required dangerous climbing to reach. By including them, Clara May was telling him she knew these mountains better than he ever could, that she could disappear any time she chose. But she'd also shared food with him, a gesture that carried meaning in the wilderness code of honor. Her question, why, could have meant a dozen different things. Why was he leaving supplies? Why was he trying to help now? Why had he allowed her family to be destroyed? Why should she trust anything he said? Everett pulled out paper and pencil, considering his response carefully. Finally he wrote, "Because I was a coward 15 years ago, and I'm trying not to be one now, because your brother died for the truth, and that truth deserves to be heard. Because you've carried this burden alone too long." He left the note weighted down by the same river stone, along with fresh supplies and a small leather pouch containing something he'd retrieved from his father's personal effects, a bundle of letters tied with a faded ribbon. The letters were correspondence between his father and territorial officials, written during the early days of settlement when Thomas Kane was trying to establish fair practices for land acquisition and development. They detailed his father's efforts to ensure that expansion didn't come at the cost of existing settlers' rights, his proposals for compensation and relocation assistance for displaced families. If Thomas Kane had lived to see what his son's empire became, he would have been ashamed. 3 days later, Everett found another exchange waiting for him. His note was gone, and in its place were a handful of pressed wildflowers and a longer piece of paper with more of Clara May's careful handwriting. "Your father sounds like a good man. I remember my mother talking about him, said he was fair in his dealings, honest about his intentions." She wondered what happened to that fairness when his son took over. Reading his letters, I think I understand why you feel guilty, but guilt doesn't bring back the dead. Beside the note was something that made Everett's throat tight, a small bundle wrapped in oiled cloth. Inside were pressed flowers from Martha Harper's garden, preserved between pages of an old Bible, mountain columbines, Indian paintbrush, and wild roses that had somehow survived 15 years of careful tending. The flowers were from the garden that had burned with the Harper homestead, seeds that Clara May must have saved before fleeing into the wilderness. She'd carried these memories of her mother's love into the mountains, preserving them through 15 winters of survival. Now, she was sharing them with the man whose choices had destroyed everything else. Everett wrote back, "You're right that guilt doesn't bring back the dead, but maybe the living can still choose to do what's right. I have your brother's evidence, the box he died trying to save. The men who killed him are still free, still powerful, still dangerous. If you're willing to trust me, we might be able to change that." He left the note along with something else, a small wooden box containing a few items from Daniel Harper's personal effects that had been recovered from the sheriff's office. A badge, a few coins, and a photograph of the Harper family taken at a church picnic the summer before Daniel died. In the photo, Clara May stood beside her brother, both of them smiling, her face unmarked by fire or sorrow. When Everett returned the next morning, he found Clara May waiting for him. She sat on the foundation stones of what had been her family's front porch, wearing the heavy wool coat he'd left several days earlier. The transformation from the frightened woman who'd fled his presence was remarkable. She looked older, more weathered, but also more present. The wariness was still there in her dark eyes, but it was tempered now by something that might have been curiosity. "You came back," Everett said, dismounting slowly to avoid startling her. "I never left." Clara May's voice carried the authority of someone who'd learned to be comfortable with solitude. "I've been watching you every morning, trying to decide if you were sincere or just working another angle. And, still deciding." She held up the photograph from Daniel's effects. "This was taken 3 months before he died. We were so young then, so sure we had time for everything we wanted to do." Everett approached carefully, stopping several feet away to give her space. "Tell me about him." "About Daniel." Clara May studied the photograph for a long moment before speaking. "He was going to marry Sarah Whitmore that fall. Had it all planned, the ceremony, where they'd live, how many children they wanted. Daniel always said the territory needed good people to make it into something decent, and he was determined to be one of them. He was investigating the land acquisitions. More than that, he was investigating a conspiracy that reached all the way to the territorial capital. Men who were using violence and intimidation to steal land, then selling it to Eastern investors for huge profits. Your name was on those documents, Mr. Kane." "Read to." Everett nodded, feeling the weight of his father's pocket watch against his chest. "I know. I've seen the evidence. And I know that my willful ignorance made me as guilty as the men who lit the fire." "Willful ignorance." Clara May repeated the words thoughtfully. "That's an interesting way to put it. Most men would claim they were victims too, manipulated by partners they trusted. Most men don't have to look at the woman whose family they helped destroy." For the first time since he'd found her, Clara May almost smiled. It was a ghost of the expression he'd glimpsed in their first encounter, but it was there. "You really think there's a way to bring them to justice? After all this time?" Everett met her gaze steadily. "I think your brother died believing the truth was worth fighting for. I think 15 years of hiding is long enough, and I think the territory deserves to know what kind of men have been running things." Clara May stood slowly, still clutching the photograph of her family. When she spoke, her voice carried 15 years of accumulated determination. "Then we'd better get started." Clara May's hidden cabin was even more remarkable than Everett had imagined during their first encounter. Nestled in a natural depression between towering pines, it was invisible from more than 20 feet away, perfectly camouflaged by design and 15 years of careful maintenance. The structure itself was modest but solidly built, with walls of chinked logs and a roof covered in sod that sprouted wild grasses and small flowers. "Built it myself the first winter," Clara May said, leading him through the narrow entrance. "Nearly died 3 times learning how to do it right. But mountain living doesn't leave much room for mistakes." Inside, the cabin was a testament to ingenuity and determination. Hand-hewn furniture filled the single room efficiently, a bed built into an alcove, shelves carved directly into the log walls, a stone fireplace that provided both heat and cooking space. Everything had been crafted with care and an eye for beauty, despite the harsh circumstances. But it was the small details that truly revealed who Clara May had become during her years of isolation. Books lined makeshift shelves, their spines showing titles ranging from practical guides to poetry collections. Hand-carved wooden bowls and cups sat beside the fireplace, each one shaped with the same delicate skill Everett had seen in the mountain jay she'd left for him. A small loom in one corner held the beginnings of a woolen blanket, dyed with colors extracted from mountain plants. "You've built a life here," Everett said, genuine admiration in his voice. "I've built survival," Clara May corrected, but there was pride beneath the modesty. "The life I should have had burned with my family's house." On a small table near the window sat Clara May's most precious possessions, the pressed wildflower from her mother's garden, now carefully mounted in a frame carved from mountain ash. The flower was a delicate mountain columbine, its purple petals still holding traces of their original color despite 15 years of preservation. Beside it lay her father's wooden cross and a small leather journal filled with her careful handwriting. "I write to them sometimes," Clara May said, noticing his gaze. "My family. Tell them about the seasons up here, about the things I've learned, about whether I think they'd be proud of who I've become. What do you think they'd say about seeking justice for Daniel?" Clara May was quiet for a long moment, her scarred fingers tracing the edge of the flower frame. "My mother would worry about the danger. She always said revenge was a poison that hurt the one seeking it more than the target. But Daniel," she smiled slightly, "Daniel would say that justice and revenge aren't the same thing, and that sometimes you have to fight for what's right, even when it's dangerous." Everett pulled out Daniel Harper's evidence box, setting it carefully on the small table. "Then let's see what your brother left us to work with." They spent the morning examining the documents, with Clara May providing context that transformed dry legal papers into a narrative of systematic corruption. She pointed out properties on Daniel's map where families had been driven off through accidents and intimidation, explained the significance of certain business partnerships, and identified victims whose stories had never been told. "Here," she said, pointing to a series of financial records, "Daniel tracked money flowing from Eastern investors through your partner's accounts, then out to men who specialized in making problems disappear. Theodore Blackwood was the organizer. He recruited the muscle and planned the operations. Marcus Vale handled the legal side, making sure the land transfers looked legitimate after the fact. And my role? You provided legitimacy. Your family name, your reputation for honest dealing, it gave their operation credibility with investors and territorial officials. When people saw Everett Kane's signature on documents, they assumed everything was above board. The weight of that knowledge settled on Everett like a physical burden. His desire for success, his willingness to trust his partners without asking difficult questions, had provided cover for murder and theft across the territory. "There's something else," Clara May said quietly. She opened her leather journal and pulled out a folded paper that had been pressed between its pages. "The night Daniel died, he gave me this. Made me promise to keep it safe if anything happened to him." Everett unfolded the paper with trembling hands. It was a letter of appointment signed by the territorial governor, naming Daniel Harper as a special investigator with authority to pursue corruption cases across multiple counties. Daniel hadn't just been a local sheriff investigating land disputes, he'd been working directly for the territorial government, building a case that would have reached all the way to the capital. He was working undercover, Clara May continued. The governor suspected that organized criminal activity was driving land acquisitions throughout the territory, but he needed proof. Daniel volunteered to investigate, even though he knew it would put his life at risk. "This changes everything," Everett said, staring at the official document. If Daniel was acting as a territorial agent, his murder would be considered an attack on the government itself. Which is why they had to make it look like an accident. A sheriff dying in a house fire was tragic but not suspicious. A territorial agent being murdered would have brought federal marshals into the territory. Everett thought about the implications. If they could prove Daniel's true role, if they could connect his murder to Blackwood and Vale's operation, the consequences would extend far beyond local justice. The territorial government would have to act, and act decisively. "Clara May," he said carefully, "there's something you need to know. Taking this evidence public won't just destroy my partners, it'll destroy me too. My reputation, my business, everything I've built. Are you prepared for that?" She met his gaze directly, and for a moment he saw not the scared girl who'd fled into the wilderness, but the woman who'd survived 15 years of isolation through sheer determination. "Mr. Kane, I've been dead to the world for 15 years. I've lived in hiding, never able to use my real name or contact anyone from my old life. I've missed births and weddings and funerals of people I loved. I've watched my parents' graves from a distance, unable to visit them properly. If bringing my brother's killers to justice costs you your empire, I can live with that." Her words were delivered without malice, but they carried the weight of absolute conviction. Clara May Harper had already lost everything that mattered to her. She had nothing left to lose and everything to gain from seeing justice done. "There's one more thing," Clara May said, reaching into a wooden box beside her bed. "Something that might help us, or might get us both killed." She pulled out a small object, wrapped in leather, a Derringer pistol, its silver surface engraved with initials that made Everett's blood run cold. "T.B.," he read aloud. "Theodore Blackwood dropped it the night they killed Daniel. I picked it up during the fire, thinking it might be useful someday." Clara May's smile was grim. "Turns out I was right. The Derringer was more than evidence, it was a direct link between Blackwood and the murder scene. Combined with Daniel's territorial appointment and the financial records, it provided a clear path to prosecution. But it also meant that Clara May had been carrying proof of murder for 15 years, never knowing if the men who'd killed her brother might discover she was still alive and come looking for what she'd taken. "They're going to fight back," Everett said quietly, "when they realize what we have, when they understand that their secret isn't buried anymore. They'll do whatever it takes to protect themselves." "Let them come," Clara May replied, her scarred face set with determination. "I'm tired of hiding." The revelation came 3 days after Clara May had shown Everett the Derringer. They were at the cabin, carefully organizing Daniel's evidence into a coherent case, when Clara May suddenly went rigid at the sound of approaching hoofbeats. In one fluid motion, she grabbed a rifle from beside the door and motioned for Everett to stay silent. "3 riders," she whispered, moving to a window that offered a view down the narrow trail, moving careful-like, trying not to make noise. Everett joined her at the window, keeping low. Through the trees he could see 3 men on horseback, all armed and scanning the forest as they approached. Even at a distance, he recognized the lead rider's distinctive black coat and silver-handled revolvers. Marcus Vale had found them. "How did they—" Everett began, but Clara May cut him off with a sharp gesture. She was studying the riders with the focused attention of someone whose survival had depended on reading danger for 15 years. "That's not just Marcus Vale," she said, her voice tight with something that might have been fear or rage. "Look at the man on the bay horse, the one with the deputy's badge." Everett squinted through the window, and his blood turned to ice. The 3rd rider was wearing a sheriff's badge that caught the afternoon sunlight, a badge that looked exactly like the one Daniel Harper had carried 15 years ago. "That's Sheriff William Morrison," Clara May said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Daniel's replacement. The man who's been wearing my brother's badge for 15 years. The implications hit Everett like a physical blow. Morrison hadn't just replaced Daniel Harper as sheriff, he'd been part of the conspiracy from the beginning. The investigation into Daniel's death, the search parties looking for Clara May, the official reports that had closed the case, all of it had been managed by one of the killers themselves. He was there that night," Clara May continued, her knuckles white on the rifle stock. "I couldn't see his face in the firelight, but I remember that badge. Daniel had it specially made when he became Sheriff, sterling silver with a mountain design around the edges. Morrison's been wearing my brother's badge all this time." Everett's mind raced through the implications. If Morrison had been part of the conspiracy, it meant the corruption reached deeper than anyone had imagined. The sheriff's office, the territorial government, possibly even the federal marshals who'd been sent to investigate all of it, could be compromised. "We need to get out of here," Everett said, but Clara May shook her head. "There's only one trail down from this cabin, and they're on it. Besides, running away is what I've been doing for 15 years. I'm done running." She moved away from the window and began pulling items from a wooden chest beneath her bed. The first was a canvas bag that contained Daniel's badge, the real one, not the replica Morrison had been wearing. The second was something that made Everett's breath catch, a small metal object that looked like a star pin. "What is that?" "Daniel's deputy badge, the one he wore before he became sheriff." Clara May's voice was steady, but her hands trembled slightly as she held the tarnished metal. "He gave it to me the night before he died, said he wanted me to have something to remember him by. I thought it was just sentiment. But now—" She turned the badge over, revealing an inscription engraved on the back. "T-A-D-H, Evidence Protocol 7. T-A, Everett said slowly. "Territorial agent?" And Evidence Protocol 7 was something Daniel mentioned in his letters to the governor. A way of protecting crucial evidence by creating multiple copies and hiding them in different locations. The hoofbeats were closer now, and Clara May moved with sudden urgency. She opened another wooden box, this one hidden beneath a loose floorboard, and pulled out a thick bundle of documents wrapped in oiled cloth. "These are copies," she said quickly. "Daniel made duplicates of everything and hid them here the week before he died. He knew someone in the sheriff's office was feeding information to the conspirators, so he created a backup plan." Everett stared at the documents in amazement. "You've had a complete copy of the evidence all this time?" "I've had Daniel's insurance policy, names, dates, financial records, witness statements, everything he collected over 6 months of investigation. The metal box they killed him for only contained part of the evidence. The rest has been here, waiting." The sound of horses had stopped, replaced by the careful footsteps of men trying to move quietly through the forest. Clara May checked her rifle and moved to a position where she could cover the cabin's entrance. "They'll try to take us alive first," she said with grim certainty. "They need to know what evidence we have and who else might know about it. But once they get what they want—" She didn't need to finish the sentence. Everett understood perfectly. They would both end up like Daniel Harper, victims of an unfortunate accident that would close the case forever. "There's a back window," Clara May said quietly. "You can make it to the trees if you move fast. Take the evidence and get it to someone in the territorial capital, someone who isn't connected to Sheriff Morrison. I'm not leaving you. This isn't about noble gestures, Mr. Kane. This is about finishing what my brother started. If we both die here, Daniel's evidence dies with us." Before Everett could argue further, Marcus Vale's voice called out from the trees surrounding the cabin. "Clara May Harper, we know you're in there. We also know you've got company. Now, we can do this easy, or we can do it hard. But either way, you're coming with us." Clara May positioned herself beside the window, rifle ready. "Why don't you come a little closer, Marcus? I've got 15 years of mountain living to show you. Now that's not friendly. We just want to talk, clear up some old misunderstandings. Like the misunderstanding that killed my brother? There was a pause, and when Vale spoke again, his voice held a note of genuine surprise. Your brother died in an accident, girl. House fire. Tragic but not suspicious. Then why are you here with Sheriff Morrison? Wearing guns and hunting me like an animal? Another pause, longer this time. Everett could almost hear the mental calculations as Vale and Morrison realized that Clara May knew more than they'd expected. Seems like you've been talking to the wrong people, Clara May, getting ideas that might not be healthy for you or your new friend. The only unhealthy thing here, Clara May called back, is men who murder sheriffs and steal their badges. The silence that followed was different, charged with the kind of tension that preceded violence. Everett could see movement through the trees now, shadows shifting as the three men positioned themselves around the cabin. Sheriff Morrison, Clara May called out suddenly. How does it feel to wear a dead man's badge? Does it keep you awake at night, knowing you're wearing something you stole from the man you murdered? That's enough. Morrison's voice cracked like a whip, all pretense of civility abandoned. 15 years I've been wondering if you really died up here, or if you were just hiding like a coward. Turns out you're just as troublesome as your brother. My brother was twice the lawman you'll ever be. Your brother was a fool who didn't know when to mind his own business. Just like you. Lever, nummon speedies. Clara May looked at Everett, her scarred face set with grim determination. When the shooting starts, you go out the back window. Don't look back. Don't try to help me. Get that evidence to someone who can use it. Clara, promise me. Before Everett could answer, the first gunshot shattered the afternoon calm. Wood splintered from the cabin's front door as Morrison's bullet punched through the thick logs. Clara May returned fire immediately, her rifle barking as she sent a shot toward the muzzle flash in the trees. The battle for justice and survival had begun. But as more shots rang out and bullets began chewing chunks from the cabin walls, Everett realized they were facing more than just 3 killers. Other voices were calling out from the forest. More horses could be heard approaching through the trees. Marcus Vale hadn't just brought Morrison and 1 gunman, he'd brought an army. Clara May had been hiding from these men for 15 years, protecting evidence that could destroy them all. Now they'd found her, and they were determined to end the threat once and for all. The only question was whether Daniel Harper's evidence would survive long enough to see justice done. The gunfire stopped as suddenly as it had begun, leaving an ominous quiet that seemed to press against the cabin walls. Clara May kept her rifle trained on the forest, counting muzzle flashes and trying to determine how many men they were facing. 8, maybe 10, she whispered to Everett. They've got us surrounded, but they're being careful, still want us alive if possible. Everett crouched beside the back window, clutching Daniel's evidence bundle against his chest. Through the glass, he could see movement in the trees, men positioning themselves to prevent any escape attempt. These weren't just hired guns. They moved with the discipline of professionals who'd done this kind of work before. Clara May Harper. Marcus Vale's voice carried across the clearing, artificially friendly despite the circumstances. Let's be reasonable about this. You've been living up here like a hermit for 15 years. Don't you think it's time to come back to civilization? I tried civilization once, Clara May called back, not moving from her position. Didn't much care for the company. Now that's hurtful. We're offering you a chance to tell your side of the story, clear up any misunderstandings about what happened to your family. Clara May's laugh was bitter. The only misunderstanding is that you thought you'd gotten away with murder. Another voice joined the conversation, Sheriff Morrison, his tone carrying the authority of 15 years, wearing a stolen badge. Miss Harper, I'm going to be straight with you. We know you've got evidence you think proves something happened to your brother. We're prepared to listen to your concerns and address them through proper legal channels. Proper legal channels, Clara May repeated. Like the proper legal investigation you conducted into Daniel's death? The one that concluded a sheriff died trying to save cattle from a barn fire? Evidence can be misinterpreted, especially by someone dealing with grief and trauma. What looks like conspiracy might just be unfortunate coincidence. Everett watched Clara May's face as Morrison spoke, saw the way her jaw tightened with suppressed rage. For 15 years, she'd been forced to listen to the official story of her brother's death, knowing it was a lie but unable to speak the truth. Now the man who'd helped create that lie was trying to gaslight her into believing her own memories were wrong. Theodore Blackwood's Derringer says otherwise, Clara May called out suddenly. The one he dropped while murdering my brother. The silence that followed was different, tense, and dangerous in a way that made Everett's skin crawl. When Morrison spoke again, his voice had lost all pretense of reasonableness. You always were too smart for your own good, just like Daniel. Some people don't know when to leave things alone. Some people don't know when to stop covering up their crimes. A new voice joined the conversation. Theodore Blackwood himself, his tone carrying the cold authority of a man accustomed to making problems disappear. Miss Harper, you've had 15 years to come forward with whatever evidence you think you have. The fact that you chose to hide instead of seeking justice tells me you understand the precarious nature of your position. I understand that coming forward 15 years ago would have meant a quick death and a quiet burial, just like my brother. Your brother chose to interfere with legitimate business operations. He paid the price for that interference. Clara May's rifle never wavered, but Everett saw her free hand clench into a fist. Legitimate business operations don't require murdering sheriffs. Sometimes progress requires difficult decisions. Your brother represented an obstacle to the territory's development. Removing that obstacle benefited everyone in the long run. The casual way Blackwood discussed murder, as if Daniel Harper's life had been nothing more than a business expense, sent cold fury through Everett's chest. These men hadn't just killed for money. They'd convinced themselves they were justified in doing it. The territorial governor might disagree, Clara May said quietly. Especially when he learns his special agent was murdered to cover up a land-grabbing scheme. Another dangerous silence. Then Blackwood's voice again, sharp with sudden concern. What did you say? Daniel was working directly for the territorial government. His investigation had federal backing. Killing him wasn't just murder, it was an act of sedition against the United States government. Everett heard urgent whispers from the forest. Men discussing this new information and its implications. If Daniel had been operating as a federal agent, his murder would bring consequences that reached far beyond territorial justice. Federal marshals, military investigators, maybe even congressional oversight, the kind of attention that could destroy careers and end with hangings. You're bluffing, Vale called out, but uncertainty colored his voice. Am I? Daniel's appointment papers are signed by the territorial governor himself. His evidence protocols were approved by federal authorities. And I've got copies of everything, hidden where you'll never find them. More whispered conversations, more urgent planning. Everett could see the dynamic changing. What had started as a simple cleanup operation was becoming something much more dangerous for the conspirators. Here's what's going to happen. Blackwood's voice had gone cold and final. You're going to come out with your hands up, turn over whatever evidence you have, and accept that some secrets are too dangerous to share. In return, we'll make sure your death looks like natural causes instead of an unfortunate accident. That's generous of you, Clara May replied dryly. But I've got a counter-offer. I'm listening. You and your men mount up and ride away, leave the territory and never come back. In exchange, I'll give you a 10-minute head start before I ride to the territorial capital with Daniel's evidence. Blackwood's laughter was ugly and without humor. You've been alone in these mountains too long, girl. You've forgotten how the world really works. I've learned exactly how the world works. The question is whether you've learned that 15 years can change a person. Everett watched Clara May as she spoke, seeing not the frightened girl who'd fled into the wilderness, but the woman those years had forged. She moved with the confident economy of someone who'd survived through skill and determination, who'd learned to read wind and weather, and the subtle signs that meant the difference between life and death. "Clara," he whispered urgently, "they're not going to negotiate. They can't afford to let us live." "I know." Her voice was calm, almost peaceful. "But they also can't afford to just burn us out. They need to know what evidence exists and where it's hidden. That gives us options." From outside came the sound of men moving through the forest, taking new positions around the cabin. Everett counted at least 12 different voices. Now this wasn't just the original 3 riders, but a substantial force that had been assembled specifically to deal with the Clara May problem. "They've been planning this," he realized aloud. "They've known for a while that you might still be alive." Clara May nodded grimly. "I've seen riders in the high country over the past few months, men who moved like they were searching for something. I thought maybe they were hunting cattle thieves or horse rustlers. Turns out they were hunting me." She reached into her shirt and pulled out a small metal object, a key that caught the fading afternoon light. "Daniel's evidence isn't just in this cabin, Mr. Kane. It's in a dozen different hiding places throughout these mountains, all marked on a map that's locked in a bank vault in Denver." Everett stared at the key, understanding dawning. "You've been preparing for this day for 15 years. I've been preparing to make sure Daniel's truth outlives anyone who tries to bury it. These men think they can silence the evidence by silencing me, but they're 15 years too late for that strategy." Outside, Blackwood's voice carried across the clearing with renewed authority. "Miss Harper, I'm going to count to 10. If you're not walking out that door with your hands up when I reach 10, we're going to start this cabin on fire. Your choice is surrender or burn." Clara May checked her rifle and moved to a position where she could see multiple approaches to the cabin. "Mr. Kane, there's a root cellar beneath the floor in the back corner. It connects to a tunnel that comes out near the creek. When the shooting starts, you take Daniel's evidence and you run. I'm not leaving you to face this alone." "You're not leaving me. You're finishing what Daniel started." She met his gaze with eyes that held no fear, only determination. "Promise me that no matter what happens, you'll get that evidence to someone who can use it." Before Everett could answer, Blackwood's voice began the countdown that would end with violence or death. 10. Clara May raised her rifle. 9. Everett clutched the evidence bundle tighter. 8. From the forest came the sound of men moving into final positions. 7. Clara May's finger found the trigger. 6. Everett located the root cellar entrance. 5. The afternoon light began to fade, casting long shadows across the clearing. 4. Clara May took a deep breath and aimed at the trees. 3. Everett prepared to run toward the back of the cabin. 2. The silence stretched like a held breath. 1. The battle for Daniel Harper's justice was about to begin. The explosion of gunfire that erupted at the end of Blackwood's countdown was unlike anything Everett had ever experienced. Bullets punched through the cabin walls from multiple directions, sending splinters flying and filling the air with the acrid smell of gunpowder and pine sap. Clara May's rifle barked twice in quick succession, and someone in the trees screamed in pain. She moved like liquid mercury, flowing from window to window and making every shot count while staying below the line of fire that was systematically destroying her home. "Go!" she shouted to Everett between shots. Root cellar now, but Everett couldn't move, watching Clara May fight for her life, for both their lives, with the calm precision of someone who'd spent 15 years preparing for this moment. He realized he couldn't abandon her to face Daniel's killers alone. Instead, he grabbed his father's rifle from where it leaned against the wall and took position at the back window. The Winchester was a familiar weight in his hands, crafted by the same gunsmith who'd made weapons for his father's ranch. Thomas Kane had taught his son to shoot not for sport, but for protection, and now that training would serve justice instead of profit. Through the window, Everett could see three men advancing through the trees, using the massive pine trunks as cover while they closed the distance to the cabin. One carried a torch they were planning to burn Clara May out if bullets couldn't finish the job. Everett's first shot took the torchbearer in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending the burning brand flying harmlessly into the underbrush. His second shot splintered bark inches from another attacker's head, forcing the man to dive for better cover. "I told you to run," Clara May called out. But there was something in her voice that might have been gratitude. "I told you I'm not leaving," Everett replied, working the Winchester's lever action. "We finish this together." The attackers had regrouped quickly, pouring concentrated fire at both windows to keep their targets pinned down, while other men moved to surround the cabin completely. Clara May's 15 years of mountain living had taught her to conserve ammunition. Every shot she fired found its target or came close enough to matter. But they were outnumbered at least 6-1, and their ammunition wouldn't last forever. "They're trying to get behind us," Clara May warned, indicating movement she'd spotted through gaps in the cabin's log walls. "Once they have crossfire established, we won't be able to hold them." Everett could see the tactical situation deteriorating. The cabin that had protected Clara May for 15 years was becoming a trap. They needed to break out, but the open ground around the structure offered no cover for an escape attempt. That's when Clara May revealed another surprise from her years of careful preparation. She moved to what looked like a solid section of floor and pulled up 3 boards in rapid succession, revealing not just the root cellar Everett had expected, but an elaborate tunnel system that extended in multiple directions beneath the cabin. "Daniel's idea," she said, reloading her rifle with practiced efficiency. "He said a lawman always needed a way out when the odds went bad. I improved on his design over the years." The tunnel entrance was wide enough for a person to crawl through quickly, with wooden supports that spoke of careful engineering. More importantly, Everett could feel air movement that indicated multiple exits. Where does it come out? 3 different places: the creek, the old mine shaft up the ridge, and a cave system that connects to the valley on the other side of the mountain. They can't watch all 3. A new barrage of gunfire forced them both to take cover as bullets chewed through the cabin's walls with renewed intensity. When the shooting stopped, they could hear Blackwood's voice calling from the trees. "Clara May, this is your last chance. Come out now, and we'll make this quick. Keep fighting, and we'll take our time with both of you." "Here's my answer," Clara May called back, sending another carefully aimed shot toward the sound of his voice. The return fire was immediate and overwhelming. Wood splinters filled the air like deadly confetti, and the cabin's single window on the front wall exploded inward as multiple bullets found their mark. "They're rushing us," Clara May said, seeing movement through the gaps in the walls. "It's now or never." She grabbed Daniel's evidence box and thrust it toward the tunnel entrance. "You first. Follow the tunnel toward the sound of running water that leads to the creek. Stay low and move fast." "What about you?" "I'll be right behind you, but someone needs to slow them down or they'll just follow us into the tunnels." Everett understood what she was planning and felt something cold settle in his chest. "Clara, don't. My brother died for this evidence. I won't let his sacrifice be meaningless." She moved to the cabin's front wall, where she'd hidden something behind a loose board, 3 sticks of dynamite wrapped together with a long fuse. Clara May had been preparing for this confrontation in ways Everett was only beginning to understand. "When I light this, you'll have about 30 seconds to get clear of the cabin. The explosion should buy us enough time to reach the creek. And if it doesn't..." Clara May's scarred face split into a grin that was fierce and beautiful and utterly unafraid. "Then at least we'll take some of Daniel's killers with us." The sound of boots on the cabin's front porch decided the matter. Clara May struck a match and touched it to the fuse, which began burning with a steady hiss that sounded like time itself running out. "Move!" she shouted, pushing Everett toward the tunnel entrance. Behind them, the fuse burned steadily toward 30 seconds of justice, 15 years in the making. Everett dropped into the tunnel with Daniel's evidence clutched against his chest, the sound of the burning fuse loud in his ears. Behind him, Clara May fired 3 quick shots through the front wall before diving into the tunnel entrance just as Boots crashed through the cabin door. They crawled through absolute darkness, following a passage that Clara May had carved and reinforced over 15 years of patient work. The tunnel was narrow but well constructed, with wooden supports every few feet and drainage channels that kept the floor relatively dry. It spoke of someone who'd understood that survival might one day depend on having multiple ways out of any situation. Behind them, muffled shouts indicated that Blackwood's men had discovered the tunnel entrance, but their voices were growing fainter as the passage angled away from the cabin toward the sound of running water. 20 seconds. Everett counted in his head as they crawled, knowing that somewhere behind them a fuse was burning toward an explosion that would either save their lives or trap them in a collapsing tunnel. 15 seconds. Clara May was right behind him, moving with the fluid grace of someone who'd practiced this escape route countless times. Her breathing was steady. Despite the circumstances, this was just another challenge to be overcome, another problem to be solved through preparation and determination. 10 seconds. Light appeared ahead, not sunlight, but the softer glow of late afternoon filtered through trees. The tunnel was opening toward freedom, toward a chance to get Daniel's evidence to people who could use it. 5 seconds. They reached the tunnel exit, a carefully concealed opening beneath the roots of a massive pine that overhung Willow Creek. The sound of running water had grown from a whisper to a steady murmur as the stream curved around the base of the hill where Clara May's cabin sat. 0. The explosion, when it came, was louder than Everett had expected. The ground shook beneath them, and pine needles rained down from overhead branches as the concussion wave rolled through the forest. Behind them, the tunnel filled with smoke and dust, but the wooden supports held. Clara May emerged from the tunnel and immediately began covering their tracks, scattering pine needles over the entrance and arranging fallen branches to hide any sign of their passage. 15 years of hiding had taught her that survival often depended on attention to details that others might overlook. "The creek will mask our scent," she said quietly, already moving toward the water. "But we need to put distance between us and the cabin before they regroup." They waded into Willow Creek, the cold mountain water shocking after the warmth of adrenaline and confined spaces. The current was swift but not dangerous, and the rocky bottom provided good footing as they made their way downstream toward the valley. Behind them, the forest echoed with shouts and confusion as Blackwood's men tried to assess the damage and locate their escaped targets. The explosion had bought them precious time, but Everett knew it was temporary. These men had been hunting Clara May for months. They wouldn't give up easily. "There's an old mining camp about 2 miles downstream," Clara May said as they picked their way between river rocks. "Abandoned for 10 years, but the buildings are still solid. We can rest there and figure out our next move." Everett nodded, too focused on not falling in the creek to waste energy on conversation. The evidence bundle was wrapped in oilcloth, but he still held it above the waterline to protect Daniel Harper's 15-year-old investigation from the very creek that had given Willow Creek its name. They'd been walking for 20 minutes when the sound of hoofbeats reached them through the forest. Multiple riders, moving fast and parallel to the creek. Blackwood's men were already back in pursuit, probably following the stream on the assumption that their targets would use the water to cover their tracks. "Here," Clara May whispered, indicating a place where the creek curved sharply around a granite outcropping. "We can get out of the water without leaving tracks on the bank." They climbed onto solid rock that showed no footprints, then made their way through a grove of aspen trees whose fallen leaves would conceal any sign of their passage. Clara May moved like a ghost through the forest, choosing paths that left minimal trace while always keeping them oriented toward their destination. The old mining camp appeared through the trees just as the sun touched the western mountains. It consisted of 3 wooden buildings in various states of decay, surrounded by the rusted remains of equipment that had once extracted silver from the rocky hillside. Most importantly, it offered concealment and multiple escape routes if they were discovered again. Clara May led them to what had been the mine office, a small building with thick walls and windows that commanded good views of the surrounding approaches. Inside, someone had left basic supplies, blankets, canned food, even a small cook stove that suggested the place was still occasionally used by travelers. "Safe house?" Everett asked. "One of several. I've spent 15 years preparing for the day when I'd have to run with Daniel's evidence. Every few miles through these mountains, there's a place where someone could rest, resupply, and plan their next move." As they settled into the abandoned office, Everett realized the full scope of what Clara May had accomplished during her years of hiding. She hadn't just survived in the wilderness, she'd created an entire network of safe houses, escape routes, and supply caches that would allow her to move through the mountains while staying ahead of any pursuit. "Tomorrow we ride for the territorial capital," Clara May said, checking her rifle and counting ammunition. "Tonight, we rest and let Daniel's killers wear themselves out, searching the wrong places." Outside, the sound of hoofbeats had faded into the distance, but Everett knew this was far from over. Blackwood and his men would keep hunting until they recovered the evidence or eliminated everyone who'd seen it. The question was whether Daniel Harper's truth would survive long enough to see daylight. 6 months later, the church bells of Willow Creek rang out across the valley in celebration, not for tragedy or mourning, but for a wedding that had seemed impossible just a season before. Clara May Harper stood at the altar in a simple white dress that Martha Henley had helped her choose, her scarred face radiant with the kind of joy that comes after surviving the unthinkable. Beside her, Everett Kane waited with the patient smile of a man who'd discovered that love was worth more than any empire he could build. In his vest pocket, his father's pocket watch ticked steadily, not marking time that was lost, but counting moments that had been reclaimed. The church was full despite the morning's spring rain. Martha Henley sat in the front row, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks as she watched the girl she'd once worried about finally claim the happiness that had been stolen from her years ago. Sam Wheeler stood beside Everett as best man, his lined face creased with the satisfaction of seeing his boss become the man Thomas Kane would have been proud of. But perhaps the most meaningful presence was the empty chair in the front row, draped with a deputy's badge and a spray of mountain columbines. Daniel Harper's place, saved so his spirit could witness his sister's joy. The territorial judge who'd come to Willow Creek for the wedding had also come to oversee the final resolution of the Harper murder case. Theodore Blackwood was awaiting trial in the territorial prison, along with Marcus Vale and the hired guns who'd survived the confrontation at Clara May's cabin. Sheriff Morrison's body had been found 3 days after the explosion, apparently killed while trying to escape federal marshals who'd come to arrest him. The evidence Daniel Harper had died protecting had done its work. 15 years of careful investigation, preserved through Clara May's determination and Everett's willingness to sacrifice his empire for justice, had exposed a conspiracy that reached from local sheriff's offices to territorial government itself. Federal authorities had seized properties, frozen accounts, and launched investigations that would reshape how land was acquired and developed throughout the West. Everett's own empire had been largely dismantled as part of the justice process. Properties acquired through the conspiracy had been returned to original owners or their heirs when possible, with generous compensation paid to families that had suffered losses. The Kane Ranch was smaller now, much smaller, but it was clean. "You may kiss the bride," the preacher announced, and Everett needed no further encouragement. When Clara May smiled up at him, the scar on her cheek seemed to disappear entirely, overwhelmed by the radiance of someone who'd learned that healing was possible even after the deepest wounds. The congregation erupted in applause that echoed off the church walls and spilled out into the valley beyond. As they walked back up the aisle as husband and wife, Clara May carried a small bouquet that included pressed flowers from her mother's garden, the same mountain columbines she'd preserved through 15 years of hiding, now celebrating new life instead of mourning what had been lost. The reception was held at what remained of the Kane Ranch, in the same house where Everett had spent years nursing guilt and loneliness. Now the rooms were filled with laughter and music, with neighbors who'd learned to respect the courage it had taken to choose justice over profit. Sam Wheeler raised a toast with tears in his eyes. To Daniel Harper, who died for the truth, to Clara May, who kept that truth alive, and to Everett, who finally learned that some things are worth more than money. As evening approached and the guests began to drift away, Everett and Clara May walked to the small cemetery where Daniel Harper was buried. His headstone had been replaced with one that told the truth. Deputy Sheriff Daniel Harper, territorial agent, died in service to justice. Clara May knelt beside the grave and placed her wedding bouquet on the fresh stone. "We did it, Daniel," she whispered. "We finished what you started." Beside Daniel's grave was a newer stone, Robert and Martha Harper, beloved parents. Everett had paid to have their bodies returned from the distant cemetery where they'd been buried, bringing the family back together in the soil they'd loved. "Thank you," Clara May said, standing and taking Everett's hand, "for helping me bring them home." They walked back toward the house as the first stars appeared over the mountains. The cabin where Clara May had hidden for 15 years was gone, destroyed in the explosion that had saved their lives. But she didn't need to hide anymore. The truth was out. Justice had been served, and she could use her real name again. "Any regrets?" Everett asked, as they reached the porch where this had all begun, where he'd first realized the cost of his willful ignorance. Clara May considered the question seriously, looking out over the valley where she'd been born and raised, where she'd lost everything and found it again in a different form. "I regret the years I lost," she said finally. "I regret that Daniel never got to see justice done or meet the woman I became because of what he taught me. I regret that my parents died believing I was lost." She paused, then smiled with the quiet confidence of someone who'd learned that survival was only the beginning. "But I don't regret fighting for the truth. I don't regret learning that some scars make us stronger instead of weaker. And I don't regret waiting 15 years to hear someone tell me I have a beautiful smile." Everett pulled her close, feeling his father's watch tick steadily against his chest. Thomas Kane's legacy lived on not in the empire his son had built, but in the choice to tear that empire down when it was built on other people's pain. In the distance, Willow Creek continued its ancient flow toward the valley, carrying mountain snowmelt past the ruins of the Harper homestead where new wildflowers were already growing. Some things endured despite fire and loss and time. Some loves were strong enough to wait through 15 years of separation. And sometimes, if you fought long enough and hard enough for justice, the truth really did set you free. On Clara May's finger, a simple gold wedding ring caught the starlight, not expensive or elaborate, but beautiful in its promise of a future they would build together. After 15 years of hiding, Clara May Harper Kane was finally home.